Good day. Following the last couple of days offensive in Kherson region, about which I will return to in a moment, we got news yesterday that the Ukrainian armed forces have launched another offensive, this time in eastern Ukraine, against the small town of Balaklaya. I say small town. Before the war, it had a population of around 25,000. So we're not talking about a place on the scale of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Mariupol, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, and those sort of places. It's a much smaller place, but it is believed to be a town of some significance, and its importance is that if the Ukrainians are able to recapture it, then they will be able, or so it's believed, to threaten the Russian grouping, the large Russian grouping based around Izium, the more important city of Izium, on its western flank. So this is a second offensive that the Ukrainians have launched over the last 2 weeks. Last week, they launched their offensive in Kherson region. This week, they've now proceeded with a second offensive towards Balaklaya. Now, we have an awful lot more information about what's going on in the fighting in Balaklaya than we ever have had about the information about the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region. And the reason for this is twofold. Firstly, pretty much all the battlefield information we get about these Ukrainian offensives comes from Russian sources. Remarkably, the Ukrainians and their Western allies are almost entirely silent about these operations. Now, there's some debate about why this is so, why the Ukrainian General Staff doesn't speak about these operations. I think the short answer is that the Ukrainian General Staff is skeptical about their ultimate success and doesn't want to report on an operation, either in Kherson region or in eastern Ukraine, which it may have advised against, I'll come to that later, and which it fears may fail. Obviously, if it talks up an offensive and then has to report its failure, then that is going to be hugely embarrassing and demoralizing for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian people. So the result is that Ukraine's official sources tell us nothing about these offensives, or practically nothing. When they do discuss them, they discuss them in the most sketchy and vague ways. And the same is true of Western sources that support Ukraine and get their information from Ukraine. And it's clear that the Ukrainians have also given very strict instructions to their reporters, to their soldiers, not to post anything about these offensives, be it against Kherson region or against Balaklaya, which is not cleared by the Ukrainian command. The result is that we're getting all our information from Russian sources, from Russian reporters on the ground. Now, the reason why we're getting so much more information about the fighting in Balaklaya is because there are an awful lot more Russian reporters in Donbass than there are in Kherson region, and especially in the rather remote area of the Igulets River, where most of the fighting, the really important fighting over the course of the Kherson offensive has been taking place. The reason we have more reporters, Russian reporters in Donbass, is very simple. This war, as far as Russia is concerned, is to liberate Donbass from Ukraine. So it is entirely unsurprising that this being the major area of the battle until 2 weeks ago, the war until 2 weeks ago, this being the area, the Donbass, of most importance or of most interest to Russians, because they've been told that this is the war, the place in the war which this war is all about. It is completely unsurprising that there are many, many more Russian reporters in Donbass than there are further west in Kherson region. It is, of course, also the case that Kherson region is more remote from Russia, so it's takes longer to travel there, though I think that can be overstated. But certainly in this remote place on the open steppe, on the Ingulets River, places, little villages like Andreyka and other places all that way north, it's perhaps unsurprising that there aren't many Russian journalists or reporters or bloggers who are there. So it takes a long time for information to dribble in from the Kherson battlefields, whereas we're getting constant inflow of information about the fighting in Balaklaya. And that can be misleading, because some of the impression that's been given over the last few hours is that the real Ukrainian offensive is the one against Balaklaya, and that the offensive in Kherson, against Kherson region, was some sort of feint. In fact, we can say, I think with confidence, that that is not the case. Briefly, we have a fairly good picture of the size of the Ukrainian force that's operating against Balaklaya. It is said to number around 9,000 men. Now, the force that was deployed against the Russian forces in Kherson region on the first day Ukrainian force amounted to 15,000 men, and then 10,000 men joined them in the second wave. So that already is somewhere in the region of 25,000. And if you believe that report from Legitimi, which was published a couple of days ago, and which I discussed about the various waves, there's another 20,000 men waiting in the rear, Ukrainian forces waiting in the rear to exploit whatever victory the first two waves achieve. I'll talk all about that later in this program. Now, that would suggest a total force that the Ukrainians have deployed against Kherson region of around 45,000 men, which is, of course, multiples bigger than this force of 9,000 men, which is the totality of the Ukrainian forces which have been thrown against this town of Balaklaya. So this suggestion by some that, the advance on Kherson was a feint, and that the real battle is the one that we're seeing now being waged against the flank of this Russian force in Izium, that's the bigger offensive, the real Ukrainian offensive, that seems to me to be wrong. Now, where are we with this offensive? First thing to say is that it's quite clear that the forces that were defending Balaklaya were essentially Donbass militia. Now, one thing has become fairly clear to me over the last couple of weeks about this war is that the Donbass militia, they're extremely brave soldiers, they're mainly reservists, they have difficulty holding the line against attacks by the regular Ukrainian army. The Russian regular army can defeat, in fact, invariably does defeat the Ukrainian forces in any encounter battle in open country. The Donbass militia struggles to do so. One of the reasons why the offensive in Donbass has been so incremental, the Russian offensive in Donbass has been so incremental, is that most of the fighting, as I've discussed, has been carried out, the infantry fighting has been carried out by the Donbass militia. Now, since they have all the problems that militia forces made up of reservists face, that means that the fighting has to be incremental, and there has to be massive artillery preparation before these troops can be sent into an attack. They lack some of that aggression that professional, regular troops, such as those that you find in the Russian army, have. And that has, I think, played a significant role in slowing down this offensive in Donbass. Now, the reason for that, and I'm just going to touch on this briefly, goes back to the origins of this war, which the Russians continue to refer to as the special military operation. If you remember, according to the Russians, on the 17th of February, the Ukrainian army began to shell heavily the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. After a long National Security Council meeting in Moscow, which was televised, Putin, on behalf of Russia, recognized the independence of these two republics, of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. Russia then immediately entered into defense agreements with these two republics, which it recognized. And those defense agreements were to help provide for the defense of those two republics. Because the Ukrainians continued their shelling of these two republics, the Russians then launched the special military operation in order to protect these two republics. Now, I've set this all out. I set out the legal sequence, and I suppose this is the legal sequence, not because I believe that this tells us the entire story of Russian intentions. Obviously, it doesn't. But it does explain some of the pattern in the war. Legally speaking, the purpose of the war is to defend and liberate the territory of the two Donetsk and Lugansk republics. And that inevitably means that the armed forces of those two republics, the militias, therefore have to have a predominant role in the fighting on their own territory. And that means that it's these two militias that carry out much of the fighting that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, that attack places like Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and whatever. The Russian forces that support the militia in liberating that which they consider to be their own territory are military professionals providing essentially technical roles: command and control, communications, artillery support, reconnaissance, intelligence, air support, those sort of things. Every so often, Russian regular units do become involved. So a few days ago, we learnt that the Russians committed a force from one of their regular army divisions to capture some fortified positions in the village of Marinka, which is located opposite Donetsk city, where it's clear that militia was not making very much progress. And this is essentially the nature of the fighting. It means that every so often the Russians do intervene with their regular forces, their regular infantry, but most of the infantry war in Donbass has been conducted by the militias. And by the way, it also means that the militias and their commanders have a considerable say in how the war on what is in theory their territory. Remember, Russia considers them independent sovereign states. They have a considerable say on how the war is conducted. So whilst most military analysts that I've consulted have long felt that Bakhmut is the linchpin of the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass, The Donetsk militia has been most concerned with clearing away the artillery, the Ukrainian artillery, which has been shelling Donetsk city. And that is why the main focus of the offensive over the last few weeks has been in clearing the Ukrainian fortifications opposite Donetsk city. But it goes beyond this, because it's clear that since this is supposed to be an allied war between Russia and the two Donbass republics, militia forces from the Donbass republics are also deployed in other places. And it's clear some of the forces that were defending positions along the Ingulets River, where the Ukrainians managed briefly to achieve some kind of a breakthrough. It wasn't actually a breakthrough, but anyway, they made some inroads. That the forces that they attacked there were Donbass militia. And it's also clear that the Donbass militia are the main garrison which has been defending Balaklaya. Now, what has happened over the course of the Battle of Balaklaya up to this point? Now, I want to stress this is a battle which is ongoing. It seems that the Ukrainians did, in the early hours of this attack, make some rapid advances. They captured a village which is on the outskirts of Balaklaya. They've been able to launch heavy artillery strikes along the roads leading up to Balaklaya. There's some stories, by the way, that Balaklaya has been surrounded. If you look at the maps, that is clearly not the case. But what is the case is that even roads to the east of Balaklaya can now be shelled by Ukrainian artillery. And clearly, over the course of the first couple of hours, the Ukrainians did achieve considerable advances. But they have not been able to capture Balaklaya itself. Now, there are two Russian units located in Balaklaya. They are not regular Russian army units. They are both from the Russian National Guard, which is technically an internal security organization. One at least comes from a Russian town called Samara. These units, probably not very large in themselves, were apparently offered the option by the Russian command of being withdrawn from Balaklaya, that they chose to stay, which is almost certainly consistent with the Russian operational plan. Now, why did they stay in Balaklaya? Well, the simple reason is, and I'm quite sure of this, is these two formations, they're not, as I said, regular Russian army, but they are professional soldiers belonging to this Russian National Guard, the Rosgvardia organization. If those soldiers had withdrawn from Balaklaya, I have no doubt that the Ukrainians would have stormed the place. It is the fact that these two units were almost certainly encouraged, were probably quietly ordered to stay, which explains why so far Balaklaya has not been captured. Now, what is going to happen? Now, this is a more complicated area for the Russians to defend than the open steppe in Kherson region. And that is why there were lots of reports and suggestions and rumors that a few weeks ago that General Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian military chief, had advised President Zelensky that it made more sense for Ukraine to launch an offensive in this area, places like Balaklaya, than attempt to attack Kherson region. So this is a more difficult area to defend. But I'm going to say straight away that I think that the fact that the Russians have left their troops in Balaklaya, remember the Russian command, if it wanted to pull those troops out, could have ordered those troops to retreat, but it didn't do so. So the fact that the Russians have kept some of their troops in Balaklaya means that they intend to defend it, and it means that they're going to try and reinforce their positions in the area. Now, again, it's not always easy to get a complete sense of what's going on, but there's no doubt at all that the Russian artillery and the Russian Air Force is now in heavy operations around Balaklaya. And there's no doubt also it seems to me, that Russian regular forces will quickly be deployed to this area. It's actually pretty close to Russia proper. It's not far from the large Russian ETHEREUM group, which is Russian regular army. And I would have thought that the Russians will do what has to be done to break back any Ukrainian attack in Balaklaya and to basically counter this offensive. Now, this is a fluid situation. There's always a chance that things could go wrong, that things could break down. It could be that the Ukrainians are able to pull in more troops from somewhere and overwhelm the Russian defenses. Even if they do so, it is not a disaster. But can I just say, I think that's unlikely. As of this moment in time, that seems unlikely to me. What actually happens, however, remains to be seen, and it will be decided over the next few hours and possibly days. Meanwhile, let's turn to that other Ukrainian offensive, the much bigger one, the one that took place against Kherson region, the one which we were told for weeks and months would result in the capture either of Kherson city itself, or at least the capture of Novaya Kakhovka, and which was going to cut the Russian grouping west of the Dnieper off from the rest of the Russian military. What has actually happened? Well, I've been saying in my last series of videos that it seemed to me that the Ukrainian offensive has basically ground to a stop against Kherson region. And this morning, or rather I should say this afternoon, the Russian Ministry of Defense said the same thing. Now, what it says, I'm just going to read the Russian report on this. This is from the Russian Ministry of Defense. So please be aware that this is the Russians saying this. We don't have an alternative Ukrainian account, but I have no reason to doubt that this account from the Russians is true. Anyway, this is what they have to say about the situation in Kherson region. They say, over the past 24 hours, due to high losses in manpower and equipment, Ukrainian forces have carried out no offensive operations at the Nikolaev-Kryvyi Rog direction. That is to say, from Nikolaev and Kryvyi Rog towards Kherson city and the Kherson grouping of the Russian forces. And the Russians then goes on to say, the Russian Ministry of Defense goes on to say, Russian aerospace forces, missile troops and artillery continued high precision attacks at Ukrainian units and reserve forces at this direction. High precision attacks have resulted in the neutralization of 24th Mechanized Brigade's command post near Olenovka, the manpower and military equipment of the 46th Air Mobile Brigade near Belogorka, Sukhoi Stavok and Andreyevka, Kherson region, as well as the 61st Infantry Brigade near Vysunsk and Yavkino, Nikolaev region. Attack launched by Russian aerospace forces has resulted in the new elimination of a munition depot of the 406th Artillery Brigade of the Ukrainian Army near Peremoga. Fighter aviation of the Russian aerospace forces and air defense means have destroyed one Ukrainian MiG-29 near Tokarevo and one Sukhoi 25 near Komsomolskoye. Due to high losses, the personnel of the 57th Mechanized Infantry Brigade the Ukrainian army near Belaya Krynica and Velikoye Artokovo refused to fulfill combat tasks and abandoned its positions. The enemy over the last 24 hours has lost a total of 4 tanks, 6 infantry combat vehicles and 5 other armoured vehicles, 2 pickups with large caliber machine guns and over 150 servicemen. Now, I think most of this is true. As I said, I'm always careful about these Russian claims of Ukrainian casualties, of Ukrainian soldiers killed. But overall, that seems to me to provide a fair picture of the situation. In fact, it's a picture that might be more optimistic for the Ukrainian forces than perhaps actual events on the ground might justify. Because what I'm hearing, and this cannot be corroborated, but what I'm hearing is that there are now heavy Russian reinforcements heading towards Vysokopolye. This is this village where the Ukrainians managed to capture a part of the village and made a big play about achieving a success, but where since they've been fought to a standstill. And there's also lots of reports that the bridgehead across the Ingulets River near Andreyevka is now very close to collapse. All the pontoon bridges across the Ingulets River have again been destroyed. The Ukrainian troops south of the Ingulets River are again cut off. There are apparently only limited forces left north of the Ingulets River that the Ukrainians have in that area. Apparently those forces are now lightly equipped. They lack tanks. And I've seen some rather harrowing pictures of Russian aircraft and Russian helicopter gunships flying over this bridgehead, the Ingulets bridgehead, almost continuously, bombing and machine gunning and firing at practically everything that moves. It is completely harrowing stuff. Now, if these Russian reinforcements really are heading towards Vysokopolye and do indeed drive the Ukrainians back from this village, back to their start lines, and if the bridgehead at Andreyevka is destroyed, then the Ukrainians in this offensive in Kherson will have been pushed back to their start lines. The offensive will have failed to achieve any territorial gains over the 2 weeks or so that it has been in progress. And that despite huge losses in manpower, which nobody, I think, seriously disputes any further. So it looks as if the Kherson offensive, at least, may be coming close to its end. I say that one should never underestimate the stubbornness and obstinacy of the Ukrainian leadership. They've clung on to undefendable positions throughout this war. They've poured out the blood of their soldiers in reckless attacks and pointless defences. I would not be surprised if at some point they decide to resume this offensive in Kherson region. But as of today, it looks as if it has been thrown back and that the Ukrainians have suffered very heavy losses and have achieved very little, and perhaps before long, absolutely nothing. Now, I have a feeling the same thing is going to happen at this new offensive at Balaklaya. There are reports that the Ukrainian General Staff apparently advised the Ukrainian political leadership against mounting any offensives at all. They said that all that would do would be to eat up reserves, reduce manpower, reduce the dwindling stock of machines and men that Ukraine still has, but that they were overruled by the political leadership. Like all of these reports about disputes between the Ukrainian high command, the Ukrainian military leadership, and the Ukrainian political leadership, that which we have been hearing throughout this war, there is no independent corroboration of them. There's certainly no official corroboration of them. We have no way of knowing whether or not these reports are true. They do look plausible. I will say, and I have said this before, that the greatest trap, one of the most obvious traps an analyst can fall into, is assuming the truth of a report because it appears to corroborate that which the analyst already believes to be true. I happen to believe it is true that Ukraine is making a big mistake by launching these offensives. And that lends me to give plausibility, to lend credence to these reports about disputes between the Ukrainian political leadership and the military command. But I reiterate again that merely because it appears to me credible, it doesn't mean that this report is necessarily true. Having said that, perhaps, given what we see, given what's happened up to now in Kherson region, given what I think is likely to happen in Balaklaya, perhaps it should be true. Perhaps, even if they're not pushing back against these harebrained ideas of offensives, the military leaders of Ukraine ought to be. Anyway, we will leave it at that. One thing I must say is that even whilst the Ukrainians launched these offensives in Kherson region and against Balaklaya, which the one seems to be now at a total standstill, the one against Kherson region is at a total standstill and might be reversed. The one against Balaklaya might easily be over the next few hours or days. Even as all of that is going on, we're getting now increasing reports of progress from the Russian side. Now, I said that the fighting in Donbass is being mainly conducted by the Donbass militia, the infantry fighting, but there are some units that have not been Donbass militia units that are now participating in this fighting. One of them is this rather extraordinary Wagner group. I, by the way, pronounce it Wagner group, pronouncing the W as a V, as in the composer Richard Wagner. But of course, Russians can tell me whether or not I'm wrong about this. But anyway, I will continue to refer to it as the Wagner group. Anyway, it's now confirmed that they have finally and conclusively captured and cleared this fortified village of Kadema, south of Bakhmut city. There was a Ukrainian counterattack to try to recapture at least that part of Kadema, which the Ukrainians had previously controlled, but the attack was repelled, and Kadema is now firmly under the control of the Wagner group, the militia, and ultimately, I suppose one has to say, the Russian forces. So the situation looks as if the Russians are now gradually resuming their advance around Bakhmut city. But there's also been reports that the militia, with quite a lot of support, is now finally making significant progress around the Donetsk Ring Road and that the Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian army military grouping in Avdiivka, perhaps the most important fortified position the Ukrainians have opposite Donetsk city, is indeed coming close to being surrounded. There was a rather intriguing report yesterday that the Ukrainian forces defending Sevask in the north of Donetsk region had asked for a ceasefire to evacuate wounded soldiers. And there's also, of course, been more reports of further Russian advances northwest of Kharkov city. Now, those advances, those Russian advances northwest of Kharkov city, are almost certainly being carried out by the regular Russian military. And last but not least, we're getting all sorts of reports now of heavy movements of Russian troops. And I say Russian troops, it seems large columns of regular Russian military are moving into Kherson region. These are presumably the troops that were pouring across the Kerch Bridge into Crimea, along the railway bridge, on the Kerch Bridge. And we've seen lots of pictures, there have been lots of photos of tanks and armoured vehicles, and heavy guns and rocket launchers and all of that. So it's obviously a very, very big formation that's now pouring into first Crimea and eventually Kherson region as well. And it'd be interesting to see what its purpose is. Is it to defend Kherson region in case the Ukrainians resume the offensive, or is it intended to launch some kind of offensive of its own towards Nikolaev, possibly? We'll see. And we've also got lots of pictures now of convoys of lorries rumbling through Donetsk region, Donetsk city, and these presumably are from the third corps of what is technically the Donetsk militia, but apparently it's made up of volunteers, Russian volunteers predominantly from Russia itself, and these people have been trained up to levels approximating to those of the Russian regular army. Many of them, of course, will have already served in the Russian armed forces, and they've been equipped up to the level of regular Russian military units. So again, we'll have to wait and see what all these heavy Russian military movements, what they mean. Anyway, that's where we are at the moment with all of this military activity. Now, as I said, I'm going to come back soon to bring you updates about the situation in Balaklaya and elsewhere in Ukraine, but that's all I can say at the moment. In the meantime, there's been more and more reports about lots of other things. Putin has delivered a very important speech in the Far East at an economic forum, which, by the way, a member of the Standing Committee of China's Politburo attended, the number 3 in the Chinese leadership. The Kremlin has not yet provided a complete transcript of Putin's speech, so I will wait until I've got that transcript before I discuss it in detail. And there's also been a report about, there's lots of reports coming out of Europe. Britain has a new Prime Minister, Liz Truss. She comes to power in the middle of an economic crisis. And I have to say, my own assessment of her first moves as Prime Minister is that they have been unconvincing. Perhaps the saddest event, at least sad in a kind of a way, pathetic perhaps in the sense of pathos, meaning evoking pity, is film I've been seeing of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz travelling around Germany, trying to keep up morale, trying to reassure the German people that all is well, that he has the situation well in hand and under control, even as Germany's economic situation deteriorates. And you see these pictures in which he's listened to one senses with a growing sense of disbelief by his audience. A couple of days ago, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, passed away. I'm going to discuss Gorbachev probably in another program which may appear on Locals if I find the time. All I will say is that seeing Scholz going from village hall to town hall, talking to people, trying to reassure them that all is well, it did give me a profound sense of déjà vu. It reminded me of Gorbachev in the last months of his period as leader, talking to people in what was then still the Soviet Union, reassuring them that he had the whole situation entirely out of control, even as everything around him fell apart. There we are. Anyway, as I said, I'll be back to discuss more events soon. In the meantime, thank you again for joining me today. Remember, you can get all of our programs, my programs, Alex Christophorou's programs, the Duran programs on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Telegram. You find links under this video. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And also remember to go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. Have a very good day and more from me soon.